start by just spending some time in prayer and just praising God for the opportunity to have these types of conversations, to learn from one another. So join us as we pray together. Lord Jesus, we thank you that you're a God that understands your created ones, the image bearers that you made so intimately and so deeply. God, you understand us, and you have put us in cultures, and you've put us in parts of this world, Lord, where you continue to form us and develop us. And God, we have so much to learn because of the brokenness in the world, but we have so much that we can gain because of the power of your Holy Spirit and because of your word. And Lord, we thank you for chances to grow in learning as parents, as people in youth ministry, as people working with teens and young adults. And God, I just pray that, Lord, you would bless this night, Lord. We pray that you would continue to bless the work of Springtide Research, that you would continue to bless Dr. Josh Packard, and that, God, you would just continue to show us, Lord, the things that we can do to minister to ones that we care about so much, but you're a God that cares about them in even greater ways. And so we're just thankful, Lord, for this time. We're thankful that you provide background and wisdom. And Lord, we pray for anybody that's watching tonight that has young people in their lives, or that they work with young people, Lord, that you would give them powerful revelation of the things that they need to hear specifically for them and those relationships they have and how they can use it. God, help us to grow in the process with you and to have open ears and to have a posture of learning and of humility, Lord, so that we can do the powerful work of relating with young people and displaying the love of your son, Jesus, speaking wisdom and truth into their lives as we build relationship with them, as we show them care, and as we work in their lives. And so, God, bless this time tonight, and may you be honored. And we ask this all in the name of your son, Jesus Christ. Amen. Amen. Well, welcome to everyone that's watching here tonight. My name is Pastor Matt, and we have this awesome opportunity tonight that we're getting a chance to talk about how young people think about faith. And I just want to acknowledge that this was a wonderful brainchild that came from our director of missional communities and our director of discipleship, Heather and Brian, that as we were looking at the Daring to Be Different series in the book of Daniel, and knowing that we're talking a lot about what it means to live in culture, we were looking at our young people and going, man, how can we learn how to speak and minister into their lives in so many different ways? And so that brought us into dialoguing with and a partnership with Springtide Research, which is really tonight, they're kind of our source of relationship as well as our source of some expertise here. So we have Dr. Josh Packard here with us, and he is going to explain a little bit about who he is and his role with Springtide Research. He's the head honcho in some ways, but he's also a guy that really cares about the stuff that he's been working on. And that's the part that I know I really value as I've been dialoguing with him, listening to some of his work, reading a lot of his work, is you can see the concern and the heart in what they do. And so Josh, I would love it if you could just tell us a little bit about you and about Springtide Research.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for having me here and for taking the time, Matt, to get to chat before tonight. And I'm looking forward to the conversation today. I hope I don't look too sunburned. We just got done camping. You guys, I've got my 3-day camping beard here. So we just took a little trip.
So do I.
Yeah, is that your 3-day camping beard? That's impressive. I've been I was I'm trying to say, this is strange because I just finished up my time. I just made this big career transition. So I'm going to try and find the right language. I am a sociologist, have been studying religion now for about 15, 20 years or so. I just finished my last semester as a professor, and those two careers sort of overlapped. I was teaching sociology for a long time. And then at the end there, I was doing both that and running Springtide as it was getting off the ground. And now I'm full-time at Springtide. And throughout the entire, the sort of thread that runs through all of that is that Springtide is a sociological research institute. And we'll talk more about what that means and why I think it makes some of the stuff that we do a little bit different than maybe some of the other research that you're likely to see about young people. But the commonality there for me is that I was never, much to the chagrin of my professors in graduate school, I was never super interested in sort of the academy, so to speak. I was always very looking for really applied things to do. And sociology is a really great discipline. There's too much of that knowledge that stays locked up in universities. And so always been looking to really take what I was able to learn and bring it out in the field for people who can actually use it. And that's a big part of what we do at Springtide. It's a big part of what I've been doing throughout my entire career, and now I get to do it full time.
That's so cool. Well, what we're talking about tonight is going to be really important because I think a lot of us know that how we relate to students, to young adults, is not just important; it's critical. And I know one of the things that we used to talk about when I was doing full-time youth ministry is that the noise, the presence, the life we live among students, it matters so much. It matters to them. It matters to their families. It matters to the church. And so what we're going to be talking about tonight are some things that might sound totally fresh and new to you. And in some ways, some things are going to be a reaffirmation of some truths that you knew, but like their timeliness and their power at this point in our history and in our culture and with these young people is really important. And so I'm gonna kind of hand it back to Dr. Packard here, just to give a chance to talk a little bit about kind of what some of the recent work is that Springtide's been doing and how that kind of speaks into that aspect of how young people think about faith. And then I think a lot of parents and people working with teens and young adults, they're also looking at it going, how does this work right now in a post-pandemic world where things have shifted quite a bit? Yeah. So those are a little bit of our lanes that we're going to be dialoguing on tonight. And so Josh, I'm going to put it back into your hands and you can take the lead and then we'll start dialoguing from there.
Great. And so I'll go ahead and I'm going to share my screen. I've got a few slides. We're not going to, nothing crazy here, but I do want to sort of give a lay of the land, a little bit more about Springtide and what we've managed to learn over the last really couple of years of data collection. So let's see here. We're going to go for that. All right. Everything look good there? Yep. Wonderful. So just a little bit about Springtide. This is sort of the very quick way of putting our mission statement. We believe that no young person should have to navigate life's most important questions alone. So we conduct actionable research to reflect the inner and outer lives of 13 to 25-year-olds in order to help those who care about young people care better. Matt, you put it perfectly, I thought, in the prayer that opened us up tonight. You said if you have young people or if you work with young people, this is research for you. And that's really true. I mean, a lot of our individual reports, some of which you can actually see behind me, are geared towards a particular audience. But in general, we consider the work that we do at Springtide to be geared to anybody who either has or works with young people. And the part that I said we would talk a little, there's a few things here that I want to highlight. So it's actionable research. I say all the time to our staff, this is a big thing that we spend, I mean, from design, from the designing of the research to the designing of the products to actually thinking about how we write about these things. Our sort of working mantra is that we don't want to be interesting, we want to be useful. Mm-hmm. And so everything that we're doing, and we spend a lot of time in meetings, because we are scientists, so we get carried away sometimes with things that are interesting. And it's like, okay, but can anybody use that piece of information? And if so, how? And that's where we spend a lot of our time really trying to come up with frameworks, even from the design of the questions. And you see that top part. We believe that no young person should have to navigate life's most important questions alone. Well, increasingly they are. And that's a primary concern for us. The disconnection between young people and the adults who care about them is, I think, that is the thing that worries me more than any other thing, including Sunday morning attendance, that or how often somebody prays or whether or not they believe. Mm-hmm. It's the disconnection between young people and the adults who care about them that I think is sort of the canary in the coal mine. For all of those other things. Those other things are sort of outcomes of relationships, and relationships are where they start. So that's where we're at. The one thing I said that I would mention more about is the importance of being a sociological research institute. And what that means for us is that what we're doing here is really trying to assess the entire forest as opposed to paying attention to just one tree. And in the world of religion, the church, and in the case of this audience here, like the Christian church tends to tell a story about the world where the church is at the center of it. And so they see things like, say, the rise of the nuns or the decline of attendance as like that is a thing that is happening. But sociologically, we know that there's this broader thing that is happening, of which the decline in attendance is a part. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that. And that change in perspective from this tree to this forest view that informs our work is critical because it changes what we think we can, it changes what we can do about it. So you'll see a lot of that coming from us today. And in fact, as we start off here, what I want to do in these slides is go through like what I think are the three biggest trends facing us right now with regard to young people. And the first one really doesn't seem overly religious at all. The first one is about trust. And so you might like, why are we talking about trust? This is supposed to be a presentation about Gen Z young people and their beliefs, right? Well, we can't get to why their beliefs are what they are or how concerned we should or shouldn't be about them if we don't understand what's been going on in terms of trends with regard to trust in this country. Mm-hmm. So look, this is data from Gallup going all the way back to the 1970s, asking 18-year-olds and up, how much confidence do you have in these major institutions? How much do you trust them, depending on the wording? Again, tree focused, your eyes will go right down there to the bottom of the list, and you would see organized religion from 65 to 36%. But forest focus is that every single one of these is going down. Mm-hmm. And if it was just one of these institutions that was having a decline, or even if it were a mixed bag, like we'd be telling a much different story. But the story here is that nobody trusts institutions anymore. Not young people, not the parents who are raising them. And that trend has been going on for a very long time. And we don't see any particular easing up of that. And in fact, when Springtide asks this question, all the data we collect is from 13 to 25-year-olds. So we take the extra time and money and cost and other resources to really go down all the way to 13, which is about the lowest age that you can survey and interview young people without all kinds of protections coming in place, which are reasonable. Because we think that lower age bracket really matters. But here's the trend that we see with 13 to 25-year-olds. You might look at this and think nonprofit organizations are doing okay, but look, nonprofits are still just at a 5.3 on a 10-point scale. That's that is the trend that matters here. So even among young people, like we're not seeing much difference, right? If you didn't know this before, there's probably all kinds of like doors unlocking in your mind or light bulbs going off and things like that. What this means practically on the ground, especially if you work in an official or formal capacity, let's say you teach Sunday school or you are a pastor or you even organize youth events or go on retreats or things like this, it means that the days of you being able to assume that a young person trusts you because of your affiliation with an institution, well, those days are gone. So like when I was sharing this data with my dad and I asked him like, who's an important influential adult in your life when you were growing up? And he said, he's Catholic. And he said, well, I guess the priest. And I said, that's interesting. I don't remember you talking about a priest being particularly influential. And he goes, oh no, not a priest, just the priest. Like whoever the priest was, if they had told me to do something or said that we should or shouldn't, as people, be trying to strive for some kind of behavior, he's like, I probably would have listened and tried to do it. And I can't even tell you how like my students are baffled by that notion when I share it with them in class. It is just not, we have to assume a level of distrust and we have to go and earn that credibility. We instead of just walking into it thinking that young people will automatically trust us because we occupy a particular position or title. And that is not just the case with religion. Again, as you see here, this is a story about institutions across the board. It's the story about my role as a professor. It's the story that doctors face when they see patients. It's the same story that clergy face when they're dealing with everybody, and especially young people.
Yeah.
The outcome of this, though, I think especially for young people, is that this trust revolution has really led to what we call a belonging crisis. Because you're not necessarily going to like fix trust across the board. So what is the outcome of this? Well, it means that young people are increasingly separated from the places and institutions and people, most importantly, who like sort of help them make sense out of life. The trusted experts and adults that guide them, guided me, probably guided you. You probably had teachers and pastors and youth pastors and other people, coaches, who made that kind of a difference in your life. But increasingly, young people are growing up without these kinds of connections. I just want to share a few data points here about social isolation. This is super stunning. This first slide comes from Cigna. Cigna did a big study about social isolation among all U.S. Adults. And this is a standard UCLA loneliness index. It's been given since the 1970s. For the first time ever, young people were, Gen Z, were the highest cohort. They had the most loneliness, the most isolation. That's always been the oldest group for reasons you can probably guess. And not only was Gen Z the most lonely and most isolated, but they were the most that had ever been recorded. They were the highest levels that had ever been recorded. That's nuts. So, this is super counterintuitive because we see young people as being connected, hyper connected almost on their devices and in social media. But what they tell us when we dig into the qualitative interviews with them, we've done 200 and some interviews now, along with 20,000 surveys over the last couple of years. They tell us that those relationships don't sort of carry the day for them. Like they might, it's an important part of their life and we shouldn't diminish them, but it's not enough to make them feel like they belong. And this has a tremendous impact. It has a spiritual, a mental, a physical health impact. The sort of surprising, if you follow this research at all, you see that one in the middle there, about 15 cigarettes a day. There's suicidal ideation that comes along with this, of course, mental health issues, more stress. And the numbers here are simply staggering. 66% of 13 to 25-year-olds have 3 or fewer meaningful interactions on a typical day. That's sort of eye-opening for me, especially since a lot of this, when we're talking about 13 to 25-year-olds, we're talking about a lot of people who spend a lot of time on campuses around literally hundreds, if not thousands, of peers. Something that I think as adults, many of us wish we had the opportunity to do because we sort of live in these little bubbles, and still 3 or fewer, the vast majority of them are having 3 or fewer meaningful interactions. And over 30% of young people say nobody knows them well.
Yeah.
The Varun Soni, the Dean of Religious Life at USC, I put this really, this elegantly in this op-ed that he wrote for the LA Times a couple of summers ago now. He said, where students used to ask, how should I live? They're more likely now to ask, why should I live? Where they used to talk about hope and meaning, now they grapple with hopelessness and meaninglessness. I never got the question in my first 5 years that I now get almost daily. How do I make friends? Students may have thousands of friends online, but few in real life. They may be experts at talking with their thumbs, but not so much with their tongues. And then you get to the key part there for us. As a result, many feel as though they don't have a tribe or a sense of belonging. They feel disconnected from what it means to be human. Speaks right directly to the religious and spiritual consequences of that. Now, if you need it driven home more, this takes us right back to the very first lessons in my field of sociology over 120 some years ago, and validated in many different cases and settings since, which is that belonging actually precedes believing. We get this backwards in the church all the time. We think we can convince people about a particular a set of beliefs or a statement of faith, or even getting them to go through confirmation or get baptized or take communion or those kinds of things as signals that they believe. But if that doesn't come with a community and a sense of belonging, the research shows that that's not a very durable set of beliefs. Those are not likely to endure, say, a pandemic, or moving away to go to college, or to a city for a new job, or marrying somebody who has different beliefs than you. It's the community that keeps you coming back. So when we put believing first, we may get short-term gains, especially with young people, right? Because their brains aren't fully developed. And you've seen it. Like, you can go to a camp for a week in the middle of summer with a bunch of kids and they're on fire, right? And then, 3 weeks later, a month later, it's sort of diminished. And those mountaintop experiences are really important, but if we don't string them together with a sense of belonging, then they have almost no long-term impact.
Yeah.
And it's that key. It's that piece of belonging that is really key. Last thing then, the trust revolution has led to a belonging crisis that can only be solved through relationship. When we mix all this stuff together, the declining trust in institutions, the rampant loneliness and isolation, the lack of belonging. Well, what's needed then to solve that, that very knotted ball is a framework for doing relationships really productively with young people that creates a sense of belonging. So I talked about, I mentioned that, that belonging, that believing, I'm going to get tongue-tied, that belonging precedes believing, Well, we dug into this a little bit about what role attendance plays. And it turns out that whether we're talking about churches or schools or sports or clubs or anything like that, simply showing up is not a good measure of whether or not somebody has that sense of belonging. So what you see in this chart here, in the top and the light green, you have the total sample, all the young people that we talk to. And in the dark green, we just separated out just those young people who attend religious gatherings, right? And you see that there's almost no difference about having nobody to talk to, or feeling completely alone, or feeling as if no one understands them, or that no one knows them well, or how easy it is for them to make friends. Attendance just isn't a good proxy for a sense of community, a sense of belonging, a sense of being known. And I think that's a distinct change that's come along with this distrust or disaffiliation from institutions. I think even when I was a kid, if you showed up somewhere to a football practice and a football team, or to a youth group or whatever it was, that meant that those were your people, and that is where you belonged. That is not the case anymore. Those things have been decoupled, and so we shouldn't take one as evidence of the other. And instead, what we should be looking at is the connection that people have to trusted adults in those spaces, because what we found is that attendance, when coupled with relationship, now that has a dramatic impact in the life of a young person. The magic number for trusted adult relationships with a young person is 5. If we can get them to 5, that would be great. The problem right now is that roughly a third of young people have one or fewer trusted adult in their life, and that includes their parents.
Yeah.
One or fewer for a third of young people. And look at all these numbers here. When we get from 0 to 1 to 2 to 4, and we get down to 5, right? We see all of these all these risk factors decline, these pro-social behaviors start to increase. It's all the kind of stuff that we want. That's not from attendance. That's from relationships. Mm-hmm. I'll wrap up here by just reminding you, remember we saw this thing, right? So how do we do these relationships? Because we need to rebuild trust. Well, obviously trust for institutions is low. So we're not going to be doing very effectively, probably reaching young people by trying to get them to have a relationship with a building or with an organization or even with a faith tradition. We need to get them connected to individuals. And at Springtide, what we were able to uncover in our research was a particular way of doing those relationships. And I think that's probably what Matt and I are going to talk about a little bit more here in just a minute. But it's basically these 6 elements. These 5 elements: listening, transparency, integrity, care, and expertise. For too long now, I think we've been leading with our expertise only, and assuming that people will see that the other things follow. And maybe they don't even follow. Maybe it's just me getting up there saying, I'm a professor, you should listen to me because I have a PhD. I know that's the way I was taught when I was in college, but I know that it's completely ineffective for teaching college now if what you really care about is students learning. It's saying that you're touting your degrees and all the stuff you know about the Bible is not a particularly effective way of getting a young person to make a faith commitment. It's certainly not for the long haul. Anyway, when we do these 5 elements of relational authority, we see trust levels into the 90th percentile, as opposed to hovering, in this sort of mediocrity land. When we engage them through relationships, we see trust levels through the roof. It's a pretty clear direction for me about where we should be headed. The old saying goes, they don't care how much you know until they know how much you care, right? Well, let's see what that looks like in the pandemic. We just came out with a study called The New Normal. You can get it for free on our website. 1 in 5 young people lost contact with religious gatherings, and few find virtual services meaningful. Despite lackluster engagement with faith communities, the faith of young people, though, is holding steady. I don't think that can happen for forever. We have to re-engage, and thankfully things are starting to open up. Oh, it looks like I have these out of order. Young people have seen the limits of technology and desire more substantive relationships. That was a big takeaway for us. Young people are seeing the divisive effect of the pandemic on the country. They really feel this. They hear it from their parents. They see it in their communities. And then what is perhaps the biggest finding, an already lonely generation got lonelier, and few are hearing from faith leaders. We asked, this is 2,000 young people back in March, 1 year into the pandemic. We asked them if anyone outside your home has reached out to you personally. Who was it? They could check all that apply here. They could pick every one of these options. And only 10% of young people have been reached out to by a faith leader. Given all the things that we just talked about, that's not good enough. We spent a whole lot of time. I'm not saying we shouldn't have, but I'm saying we need to spend as much time digging into the relationships as we did trying to figure out how to live stream our services on Sunday mornings. those things are equally as important if we really care about engaging the next generation in a life of meaningful faith conversations and practices. Again, here's the website, springtideresearch.org. You can get the new normal at /the new normal, but I want to stop sharing my screen here so we can get back to the conversation.
Yeah, Josh, thank you so much. And for those of you guys that have been listening, like he mentioned, there's two kind of documents that you can go on the Springtide's website that Pastor Brian just put those up for you. And one of them is that State of Religion, which is the Relational Authority Report. And it's a great document. I've been exploring it a lot in the last few weeks. And that's just very thorough with not just data. And that's what I really like about it, is it's not just, charts and statistics and stuff. It's showing you the implications of that and then some actions and practices. And that's where that other document that Dr. Packard just mentioned, The New Normal, 8 Ways to Care for Gen Z in a Post-Pandemic World. That's another one that kind of takes some of those and puts even some more legs to that with some good questions for you as an adult or a leader to stir on and write some thoughts out. And we're going to talk about a few other different pieces here. But like Josh was talking about, because everything has grown in its complexity within our world and within our culture, it's more important now more than it was even in the 90s when I was in high school to have trusted adults in the lives of teens and young adults that are going to listen to them, care for them, and guide them. And this is where the term mentor in the past had such a rich, in the 80s and 90s, it was this term that people were latching onto, and it was becoming practiced and being set up. And then over the late 90s into the 2000s, it still was being used, but you saw the decrease in that term. But that's where this concept of what it means to be an effective mentor in the life of a young person becomes super important. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that. And one of the things you were talking about, Josh, that it triggered for me was when we were talking about belonging, which is such a big piece for youth and for young adults. I think one of the parts that we forget, especially as churches have slid into such a programming mindset,
right,
is that we had to relearn how do you still saturate times with opportunities for belonging to happen, because we can't always assume that if somebody walks into a room that they're going to make a connection and feel like they belong to what's happening. And I was thinking as you were sharing through some of that, and I know there's a lot more stuff in the Relational Authority Report, I was thinking about so many different key volunteer leaders in youth ministry, not only at Bridgeway we've had here, but in other churches I've worked in, where I can talk to students 15 years later, and a lot of them, these were like Gen Y, age students, still similar things that they will not remember some of the things I taught on or some of the things we discussed. But, I had one student call me recently when I was away on a trip, and he's in his 20s, he's 23, 24 now. And he still remembered these lunches he had with one of our leaders, Brent Smith, every Sunday after church. And there was a group of guys that would go out and go to In-N-Out Burger, and he still would talk about those. And that still was something that, even though he has not been a part of our church for a long time, that still stood out, and he wanted to reach out to this former leader, Brett. And it was one of those things that it encourages your heart, right? Because you're like, okay, there still is a connection, and that connection wasn't just with the practices and what was happening. And so it was one of those win pieces, but for our leaders, but also going, man, Lord, how do we continue to nurture this? And that brings up the other question, which I think I think a lot of parents and people that are listening, we all struggle with this, which is we want to see our young adults engage with something, but when we're saying that, we're often meaning we want them to go to the program, to the service. Right. And what's happening with this Relational Authority Report and some of this work, and correct me if I'm wrong, Josh, is we have to kind of relearn how to redirect young adults to go, let's engage you with relationships and allow that to be the piece that those relationships then will draw you in to the further practices that come with, I think in the report you guys call it affiliation, right? Which is just people's kind of correspondence with belonging formally with institutions, right? And especially within churches. So would you, yeah, what would you say on that piece?
No, I think that's exactly right, Matt. I mean, the affiliation term is the one that, social scientists use. That's the one where the nuns come from, the NONES, of people who, when you ask them with which faith tradition do you affiliate with, if any, and they, skip past like Christian, Catholic, Christian, Protestant, Buddhist, Hindu, etc. They skip all those and they go to the bottom and they click none. And that's where we've seen such a dramatic rise in recent years, which is not, as we show in the State of Religion and Young People, that is not necessarily an indication that young people don't care about faith. In fact, it's not at all. It's more of an indication of, it's about this trust story. They just don't really want to be seen as affiliating with an institution because, for all the reasons that go into the making up of the distrust of them. But the thing that you bring up about, not so much focusing on programs, but relationships is true. And I don't think that's because programs were bad. I think programs were incredibly good for a very long time. And a lot of people brought a lot of innovation. There's a lot of really good work that went on there. And if the world were the same now as it was in, say, 1980, when I think programs were really thriving, then I would say, like, let's go back to the roots and let's figure out what we were doing then and do that. Maybe we've lost our way. We can do that stuff as well today as we did then, if not better. But the world isn't the same. The world isn't the same, and so it requires us to do new things. And that is not, again, that's not a slam on people who have built programs and ran them for a very long time. But we need to be bringing as much innovation and sophistication to relationships as we did to programs for so long. And I do not think you can do both, to be quite honest. In addition to the research that we do with young people, we've been hosting focus groups for the last year with religious leaders. And I haven't heard one single person, not a youth pastor, not a preaching pastor, nobody has told us, boy, you know what? I'm not really even trying that hard. I've got plenty of time left in my week. I'm barely filling up my hours. Like, nobody's saying that. Everybody's got enough to do, right? Making this move into relationships will require giving up something. And it might even require, which is scary because it may require giving up something that is still sort of kind of working for something that is untested and unproven. I totally recognize that, but the data, my job is to tell you what the data are telling us. And I think the data are pretty clear.
Yeah. And then the data allows us to start innovating, like you were talking about with what people were learning to do with program in the 80s and 90s, kind of the rise of youth ministry. A lot of people don't always realize that some of that innovation came from the 70s, 80s, and into the 90s, and then it grew into this, very innovative, creative beast, and a good beast in that way. Mm-hmm. And then people were still always interweaving the values they had of relationship and church community. And I think that's the first piece just of encouragement, I think, for anyone that's watching, listening, is that communities of faith provide a very strategic atmosphere that this relational engagement can happen in deeper ways, more organically and formally sometimes within churches, because you have other men and women that are there and they care not only about themselves, but they do care about the community. Yeah. And they care about your teens and your young adults. And that's where, as your kids move from children into teens, all the different approaches of how you show emotional warmth and parental care and leadership has to start shifting. And one of the ways that happens is they have to start having more access to other adults. And church, is one of those places that can provide a healthy access with people that are seeking to bring the same truth and wisdom into the lives of your teens. And it allows us to one, keep doing that as parents and growing as parents, but then also going, man, how do I ask? And I think of a story just in the last couple of weeks where a mom of a upcoming high school student was talking about that desire to find a mentor for her son. And again, just her even knowing that and recognizing, like, hey, I live and I am ministering among so many men and women that love Jesus, and I would love for my son to have more access to that. And now, one thing I wanted to throw in and get some of your thoughts on, Josh, and we were talking about this earlier on a previous phone conversation, is a little bit of work that I've had a chance to study on is Dr. Robert Epstein's Teen 2.0, where he talks about some of the torment of adolescence. And I'm not gonna go through all the details on that for people at Bridgeway. If you are listening and you want more information, we can send you more stuff about that. But part of that was them seeing how some of the history of how adolescence developed in the U.S., especially, and in the West. Dr. Epstein believes that plays into a lot of the torment and the problems that you see students having. And one of the conclusions he comes to from that, so they spend a bit of time on that, but where it starts moving is where I see the kind of convergence happening from what Springtide has been doing recently, because they talk about how what happened with adolescents is we put them in this subgroup and it became this vacuum where now they're only really being ministered to by other people of their age, and they don't find any adults that care for them. And so eventually that starts creating a new type of mixture. I'm going to call it a broth that's kind of bubbling. And he says, and that's a part that we have to, and he was saying the same conclusion, and this was in the early 2000s, like we need to try to figure this out. Like, how do we not allow them to be in this subculture and allow them to transfer into adulthood by having access to more adults? Some of your thoughts on that?
Well, I think that's probably even more true now than it was in and when they wrote that. It was probably 20 years ago. They're doing the writing for that work, right? Mm-hmm. That when we think about who young people are connected to, and they were very clear in the State of Religion and Young People 2020 report, they told us, we do not want adults to be our friends. Like, we have a lot of friends, so whether social friends or, in real life friends. And there's, of course, increasingly a very blurred line between those two things. But they use words like mentors, coaches, guides when they were talking about adults, because we were sort of stunned by that. Because look, I'll be quite honest. Like, I'm a researcher. I believe what young people are telling us. That is our initial standpoint. Like, if you're telling us something in an interview, it's because you believe it to be true for you. That's where we start. But we do have hypotheses, right? And my hypothesis going into this study was like, we're going to get young people who are basically just going to tell us that they want adults to condone everything that they're already doing. They just, they either want permission or they want an adult to say that was okay or something like that. Basically to be their buddy. And what we found, though, was so many young people telling us in so many different ways, both in the surveys and in the interviews, that's not what I want from an adult. I want adults who have been down this path before to share their wisdom and expertise with me, to be transparent, tell us about their struggles, et cetera. You were talking about that story of having somebody that you took out to lunch after church on Sundays reach back out to you. And I'll say, when we started asking about that, of like, give us some examples of adults that did that kind of work for you. And we asked a lot of it, because young people are really great at talking most of the time, but they're not very good at sort of abstract concepts. So it's because who is, right? Who talks about their life in abstract concepts besides social scientists? So we're asking them to drill down, and we didn't hear a single story in all of those examples. We didn't hear one instance of a young person saying, what really made a difference in my life was the sermons that my pastor gave. Or I stayed at that church, or I went to that Wednesday night because I loved the teachings. They were so relevant. For the people that have long-term connections, it was always those kinds of things that you just talked about. It was I think, I don't know if it's Diddy or Didi Mo, who just said, I remember my mentor from high school group, and I still connect with her occasionally. It's my teacher that I had in middle school, who then actually went up to the high school level at the same time I did, who ended up being a bridesmaid in my wedding, which was because she's just such an important part of my life. I don't remember what she taught me about history or English or any of both of which are classes I took from her. But I definitely remember her, and I know I know who I use as a model when I want to let somebody else know that I'm both holding them accountable, but still care very much for them. And I've leaned on that a lot as a professor. These are the kinds of things that carry us through all of these bumps, whether it's, this expectation that you should be growing up and you should have reached these milestones by this particular time because you are an adult or you are an adolescent at this, whatever. These are all very confusing times. But it's these adult relationships that are consistent that will carry you through.
Yeah, yeah, because a lot of them they want to be around people that, and I like how you explained it. It's not just friendships, but they want people that are going to see them as an adult, but they're going to dialogue through that, share their life, listen to them, and give feedback. And like you said, all those pieces of care, and that's where that leads us to like really talking new. And I think a lot of people are always going, okay, so what do we do? You know, and parents have one amount of space where they're able to do this. People in youth ministry have another amount of space. And actually, one of the things I used to remind our youth leaders quite often is that back again in the early 2000s, when they would talk about how long students might have access to a youth volunteer or a youth leader, and if they were to go to middle school and high school, that you only have a student for 4% of their life. and so we would talk about that with our staff to go, okay, that's hard, because that means that 4%, like, you have to make it matter. Like, and of course that's like a lot of pressure.
Yeah, right. I'm thinking about how that lands on the ears of like a 22-year-old right out of college.
It's a work harder. No, but part of that was to kind of remind them, like, okay, that means that every conversation you have, like you're learning, you're looking for ways to build that relationship. You're trying to be strategic, and then this is where I tried to help them, as I said, my role, our burden as a youth pastor, the paid person, is to try to equip you and train you and resource you to do that. And so, but so parents have one part of skill set that they're learning. Youth leaders have another, and then there's those of you in education and coaches and all that type of stuff that you have another access. But that's where I think it would be good to go through that. I believe it's a Pentagon you guys have to go through those 5 different pieces. And this is where it's going into things that, again, some of this is going to sound so practical, and yet we need to relearn these things. And and one of them that you guys spend quite a bit of time on in the Relational Authority Report is talking about learning how to listen all over again. And I think that part is probably one of the hardest pieces that I think even the pandemic re-racked and rerouted in so many different ways, because even as people talk, sometimes they're talking past each other. And and it always reminds me of the passage in 1 Kings 19 where Elijah goes to the mountain of God after fleeing from a tumultuous time of being chased by Jezebel. And he goes and he talks to God, and then God talks to him, and it looks like they talk past each other. That's like my metaphor that I always see it with. But I would love for you to maybe just mention a few of those kind of key points that you guys highlight in there, and then we can all kind of maybe chime in a little bit more on that.
Yeah, well, I think so. What we lay out there, and I was moving so people could see in this report about relational authority, and the state of religion in young people is something we'll do every fall. So we're working on collecting and analyzing the data for state of religion in young people 2021. It'll have a new focus. Spoiler alert: it'll be about uncertainty and helping young people navigate uncertainty. I know, right? What a surprise! What we do in there is we offer because the data were really clear that it wasn't just a relationship, it was relationships done in a particular way that mattered. The listening, integrity, transparency, care, and expertise, those 5 dimensions. And we can talk if you want here in a minute, Matt, about like how do we do this kind of work at scale, because that's ultimately like that is a thing that matters. But for parents, like where I think maybe the job of my parents was to make sure that I was involved or programmed into as many good spaces, like good and healthy spaces as possible. That I was doing some kind of art poorly, by the way. I was playing some kind of sports. I was involved in my church. The job of parents today, I would say, is really to focus on, do your young people, do your kids, the young people that you're in charge of, do they have at least 5 connections with trusted adults, and do they use them? So not just do you think, because I actually don't, when we find that 1/3 of young people tell us that they have 1 or fewer trusted adult in their life that they could turn to, I actually don't think that that's objectively true. I think it's true that young people feel that way, right? But I don't think it's true that most young people that 1/3 have 1 or fewer. I think there are adults out there who we hear from them all the time who desperately want to connect with young people. They just don't feel like they're able to do it. And so as parents, I think it's our job to help coordinate that. Now, the way that we do that then is by, sort of employing these 5 elements. You mentioned the first one, and we put it first because it's the most critical, which is listening. The dominant experience of young people when it comes to adults is of being ignored. Like, you have to start from that place. They do not think you want to hear from them. And so I'll give you just let me show you how this show, let me tell you a little bit of how this shows up in my life, or showed up in my life. For so long, we would have, I've worked at a big state school, 13,000 students. Students would walk into my office. They've been dismissed by adults all across campus for all 3 or 4 years or whatever they've been there. And they get, they come to sociology as a major late. They walk into my office and it's for advising time. Really what that means is that I'm just going to give them their schedule or their little code so they can make their schedule. But before I give it to them, I hold it like ransom. I'll even show it like, I've got it here, but I'm not going to give it to you until you tell me what you want to do when you graduate. And they're like, I don't know, I want to help people, or a pretty common answer or something. And I say, okay, tell me what that means for you. Like, give me some examples. It's not until I ask the second or third question. If you've ever done this with a young person, you know what that's like. Like, they give you that first answer as almost like I don't think that you really care, so I'm just going to say the quickest, the thing that will end this conversation the fastest, right? But when you ask the second and the third question, they're like, what is happening? Like, does this adult actually care what my answers are here? And then I would take notes on that interaction. And when they came back, and I would say, hey, so last time we talked, you said that you're really thinking about being a first responder, but your parents are the ones that wanted you to get a college degree. And so that's why you're in sociology, because you wanted to understand the people you were helping better. And they would just, like, their minds would be blown. Like, nobody, like, that's just not, that's what we mean by listening. We don't just mean sitting there passively, right? We mean actively engaged in deeply listening to the person across from you. Now, here's why I think that's so hard to do in a religious setting. It's because a lot of times that's going to result in a young person telling you something about their life that you do not condone. And all you're going to want to do is to jump in and tell them that that is not okay. They shouldn't do that. Don't date that guy. That major is bad for you. You really should be working harder and not sleeping all the time, right? But what we have to do in that moment is listen. And young people told us, they're like, we know that doesn't, just listening doesn't mean that you think that what we is okay. And by the way, we know that the things we're doing are not okay, right? That's where the listening starts to build real trust, because it shows that you see them as a person and that you are willing to engage them as a person. And that is just an absolutely critical one. And you're right, Matt. Like, we don't do it as a society very well. And we really don't do it very well when it comes to young people. So that would be if you could do nothing else, I would say, doggedly pursue them and listen to what's going on in their lives. Don't take, I'm fine for an answer, or how was school? It was okay for an answer. Dig deeper. And it will not happen on the first try. It'll take time. But yeah, it's critical.
It takes a little bit of resilience that I think takes a little bit of learning of just going, I'm not going to settle.
Yeah.
But doing it without also not becoming manic and being like hitting them with 18 questions. Right. But you're right. Like, I think when they understand that you're really listening, and I like that in the report, you guys talk a bit about body language within that and posture.
Yeah.
And like, there's so much, everyone, that you can really explore within that. And then that leads into another piece, which is that aspect of the transparency, the sharing things about your life, because then sometimes,
which is really scary, right?
yeah. Well, because at first I think we worry, because then we're like, oh, I don't want them to know like how messed up I am.
Yeah.
And that's so much of what their desire for belonging is to realize that they're another human navigating life and figuring out what it means to grow up and be formed. And when they hear someone else talking about that, the good and the challenging,
right,
that to them becomes very inclusive. And then what's cool is that not only do they realize that you want to hear what they have to say, they're curious to hear what you have to say.
Yes.
Hear about what you've gone through. Sorry,
Matt, I think this is one of the places where, like, youth directors and pastors and people who are sort of like experts in young people really have I think a fundamental role to play, because transparency is something that we were almost hesitant to include because it's so tricky, right? As a society, we've sort of lost sight of what I think is a really critical phrase, which is age appropriate. we tend to want to put things in a box. You either do or don't do these things, right? And the reality is, like, especially with young people, there's a whole bunch of stuff that you should not do, say, or experience with a 15-year-old that you also probably would do well to experience with a 19-year-old, and also only in general.
Mm-hmm.
Like, there are some, my wife works with a lot of at-risk youth, and if you didn't treat, those 14-year-olds like they were 24 in some cases, they would smell right past that, and they would totally just, they would just completely dismiss you. But it's important to be transparent and to share, like, oh, I've struggled with, like, I've struggled with my own faith at times. I've had doubts. Like, I've made this decision that wasn't a very good one too, similar to the one you're talking about right now. Like, but we have to know when not to share too much, because we've all probably done things that we, are just not conversations that a 15, 16, 17-year-old necessarily would understand the full context of.
Yeah.
And I think youth pastors can help to understand, like, where those boundaries and where those lines are, because you work with kids all day long.
Well, and I know in classes I've taught at university as well, when I talk to students about the term discretion and having to relearn what that term means in a lot of contexts, because I tell them, where do you ever see that term? And the only time people ever see it is in the beginning of movies, where it says, your discretion is advised. And then I have to go, what does that mean? Like, let's talk about that. And then what's good is then we're able to kind of re-rack on that. One of the pieces you guys had in your report that I think was really powerful as well, and I think it's because it resonated a little bit with some of Epstein's stuff, is you guys talked about that some of that transparency has to do with inclusion.
Yeah.
And letting young people see that they can be a part of understanding what is happening, how it's happening, why things are happening in an institution, in your family, in a school, and that in a sense empowers them. And it makes them feel confident that they're trusted and that they can participate. I found that part to be, like, really substantial.
Well, it's the inclusion is really you hit the nail right on the head. I mean, it's for anybody who might have taken a sociology class. I mean, this is about in groups and out groups, right? This is about how we decide who is a part of me and my story, and what people are like me and which places I'm not allowed into. And there's all kinds of really interesting things that happen with people that we consider to be in our in groups. We tend to be more forgiving of their errors. We understand and are more accepting of the challenges that they're going through. We tend to think of them as individuals instead of thinking about the whole group. With out group people, we tend to think about them, we paint with a broad brush. This is basically where stereotypes come from, is when we build walls between, in groups and out groups, which always happens. I'm not saying we should be trying to break down all those walls, but when you can establish that a young person is a part of your in group and vice versa, well, what you get is a lot more of that implicit trust. You get a lot more of that sort of like, oh, you did something that I don't understand. Well, that's okay. I know Matt, and Matt is a good person, as opposed to this, like, adults suck. Right. That's what happens when you're a part of their out group. They say adults suck, or they say, okay, boomer. Right. Like, that is, along with potentially all kinds of other really unhealthy stereotypes, but that's not the conversation we're having today. Just this basic idea that the more, and they're not going to be, look, you're not hanging out with kids like socially at a restaurant on a Saturday night or something like that. I mean, that's not what we're talking about here. We're just saying, like, making some space in your in group for young people, like you said, letting them in on the behind the scenes thinking about what's going on here, being transparent about those things. That really creates these really important bonds of trust.
Yeah. And I'm just going to mention the other three, although they're such important ones, really briefly. And then we have a number of questions that are coming through, and I want to be able to honor some of those because those are very specific to people. But like it moves on into integrity and talking about things about admitting when you're wrong, and that's so much what young people are looking for. 80% of them, I think you guys know, want that type of honesty and integrity and follow through. Which was, and I'll be transparent myself right now. Like, I think one of the things that I was thinking about as I was reading through all that was realizing, especially in the last few years, but even especially during COVID, that aspect of when you start dropping balls and you start failing in communication and follow through. And I'm going, man, how often have I done that with my own kids? And I have a 14, 11, and a 7-year-old. And how can I improve in that? Because that's one of those things that, like, I think I was better in that, but I let it slide. And then the biggest one in there, you guys talk about, because expertise is one that I think people can read on, and most people tend to understand that element, but care and what care actually looks like. And I like what one of our parents mentioned in the chat here already about, like, they're like, we need a part 2. This is so much good stuff to talk about already. And it's true. And that's where the report gives a lot. And then maybe we can get a group of parents together and people that work with young people here at Bridgeway and try to have some further conversation and dialogue on this, because, you're right, Randy, we don't want this to just be a one-time discussion. We want this to be stuff that's nurtured at Bridgeway, but that young people are looking for adults that are going to take time, and that they're going to trust people more with the more time. And that's probably the hardest one. And you mentioned this earlier, out of all adults, because we move at such a frantic and busy speed. And
young people know that. So care is essentially time. The young people experience, like, they told us, in a lot of ways, that I know somebody cares about me when they spend time with me, because what they know is that the most precious commodity that adults have is not actually money, it's time. And so you can spend all the money you want building programs and fancy things for them, but if what you want to do is convey care, then you have to spend actual time with them. This is what I meant by, like, I don't know many places that can actually do everything they're currently doing and then add this element, onto it.
Yeah. And it's learning, some of it's trying to learn how to be creative. And there's a lot of other good resources and books on that, of, like, especially with mentorship, I think learning how to not add something else in, but to include someone in. And I remember, like, one thing we used to try to coach volunteer staff on is going, how do you invite a student to come along with you on something you were already going to do?
Yeah.
Hey, I have to go to Target, Costco, and Winco.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to invite Joe to come with me, and I'm going to buy him something while I'm out too. Maybe like a soda, or the $1.50 hot dog and soda at Costco is affordable. Right. And I'm going to have time. And to them, that means a ton. And it's not that I had to, like, carve out an additional 2 hours of my week. And again, that's for more like people that are working with. As parents, we also have to figure out, how do I include them in on something that I do? But let me go ahead and hit with a couple questions here that we'd love to chat about a little bit. So one parent says, since that their young person had said to them, since God made me unsocial and depressed, why should I care about him? And then their question was, how do we care for students who are actively struggling with loneliness and social isolation?
Well, it's a great question. I think that there's, I want to be really clear here that we are sociologists and we're talking about trends, but when we're talking about individual people expressing, personal anxiety or loneliness or isolation, then I think there's a real time and opportunity there for professionals to come into play. I mean, counselors and psychologists and psychiatrists, et cetera. I mean, young people have such a way with language, right? If this is the way God made me and it's apparently unsatisfying, why should I care so much about God? And I think that this can be one of those places to say, I mean, I'm not sure that arguments are going to win the day here. So you could counter with facts of, like, look, there's a whole lot of reasons theologically why we may not be satisfied with the way that the world is right now, and yet still believe that God created the world as it is. And you can walk down that, you are a pastor, and some books can walk down the theology of that. But I think the most important thing you can do in that moment is to say, yeah, it's a really tough question. I wonder the same thing. There's all kinds of stuff that I've struggled with some of these, like X, Y, and maybe it's not loneliness for you as a parent, but maybe it's insecurity. Or maybe it's that, we've all got things in our lives that we wish weren't a part of our story, but are a part of our story that we have to try and reconcile and fit in. In that moment of listening in that way and then being transparent, there's two of the points of relational authority. You're already starting to do the work of connecting that person to somebody else. And then we can, like, let's, who I think would be really good for this conversation? So-and-so said the same kind of thing. Let's go and talk with them about it. I'm curious. We don't have to tell them anything about the way you're feeling, but I'm just curious about what they would say. And now we're starting to, to branch out and build that. It's that deep kind of relational work, right? And when we talk about bringing expertise in here, that doesn't just mean people with degrees and credentials. There's expertise for young people means a whole lot of things. And in one really important way that young people really have told us that they like for adults to share their expertise with them is to share, like, what they've learned because they've been down the same path before. And so whether that's you or somebody else, like you can bring that expertise in it. So you see how you can start like cobbling these things together in a way that's also building social connections. But just hearing it and acknowledging that it was heard and then checking back in on it and not trying to fix it in that moment. I think those are it's super counterintuitive. And as a parent, I think it's even harder than as a teacher or a youth director or a pastor or something like that. Because a parent, you just really don't want to see your kids feeling that way. But they have to feel listened to first.
Yeah. And I mean, in addition to praying, which I know, sometimes seems like yeah, I know I have been, but praying for them to have opportunities to have those deeper connections, because with some of the work you guys have been talking about, when students already don't have maybe even one connection with an adult or anyone in a week, and yet they live in a culture where there's an increase in connectivity, right? So they can be online and feel like they're seeing a lot of people, but they're not seen. They're hearing from a lot of people, but not heard.
Right.
And they're connecting, but they don't feel connected. It's then praying for as a parent, and also looking very intentionally, going, how can I put them in a spot where there's going to be a longer opportunity for them to find deeper connection? I know as a youth pastor, one thing I would coach parents in at times is I would say, some students will not be able to jump into a Wednesday night program or with a small group. But I said, but have them go on our road trip. And that's 3 or 4 days with driving sometimes for 6 or 8 hours.
Yeah.
And because we're intentional we won't let them just throw in the AirPods and be on their phones, like slowly, but it's slow. They start having some connection, but we had to lengthen their exposure. So in one sense. Here's another question somebody asks, as they said, is the weakening of the families part of the 13 to 25-year-old, is the weakening of the family part of the 13 to 25-year-olds feeling like they never are belonging and being mentored?
Well, I think it's a really, I think importantly to address the sort of assumed part of that question, that families have gotten weaker. Now, families have changed, but I would be hesitant to say that families have gotten weaker. And in many cases, when we think about, I guess what I hear often assumed in that notion that families were once strong, I think about my grandmother who was stuck in a bad marriage because she was literally not allowed to get a divorce. It wasn't legal. And that doesn't sound like a very strong family to me. And so a lot, I think about my aunt who couldn't get a job because she wasn't allowed to work because she was a woman. And that doesn't sound like a very strong family. So some of the changes that we've seen in families are because the world has changed for the better around us. Some of them are because the world has changed for the worse around us. So, real middle-class wages have hardly budged in the last 40 years in terms of purchasing power. And that's pushed a lot of what might have otherwise been one person earning wages outside of the house and one person inside the house, primarily sort of doing housework and taking care of the kids and working that way. Well, that's pushed us to a place where we need to have two incomes just to make ends meet. And I don't, this is not a blanket statement, but by and large, we don't see the church engaged in those kinds of conversations about wages. What we do see a lot of from the church is some, sort of like telling families to do better. And I just I don't know any families that are not, that's not any, I guess that's a blanket again, but as a sociologist, we talk in trends a lot. Like, I just don't see a whole lot of parents and families and adults not caring or trying. I think by and large, people are trying to do their best to make ends meet. In fact, we did I wrote a book years ago called Church Refugees, and we did a national survey on the back of that about why people weren't going to church on Sundays. And the second most common answer that people gave was that they were just exhausted. They were tired. They were working so much during the week that the Sundays were sort of their only time for families, and they would, their family would spend that morning together in the house, just actually not doing anything but being together. And I thought, like, boy, it's really hard to fault people for that. So I think families have changed. And I think families have changed in ways that do actually make it harder for young people to be connected, because it's really important to be connected to your origins and where you're from. And we know that's a primary source of fulfillment and identity for a lot of people. So the second half of that question of, like, has it made it harder for people to be, young people to be, or has it contributed to the sense of isolation? I think it probably has. It calls on us to be really innovative in terms of how we respond to those things and how we how we think about church and religion and spirituality is happening not just inside these four walls on these 3 hours of the week, but how can we, sort of move outside of that on a really regular basis without putting the onus onto other people to do that work, but how can we support that work?
Mm-hmm.
Because you're right, the world, I mean, the end result is whatever, however we get here, the end result is the same, is that families don't look today like they did, 25 or 30 years ago.
Yeah. And I know some people, like we're looking at it and we go, is it the breakdown in the moral or the structural element of family? But I think whatever we consider those pieces to be, because I know people can have different thoughts on what that weakening looks like, is trust is still disillusioned.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of those different pieces, and that's why there's always this rebuilding that has to happen. And this is a good place to also just affirm to everyone that is a part of Bridgeway or a part of any church community, that like I know that like youth volunteers and youth leaders, like their heart is to partner with you as families to help that. So even if you feel like the weakening of the family, right, whether macro or micro and personal, like they're there to come alongside of you and go, you're not supposed to be at it alone. Like we are here, and they want to come alongside you and be a blessing to the family as much as they want to mentor and be a voice and a care and an adult connection for your young adult. So we opened up I think a little bit of a big question with somebody asked about the discretionary lines, and they said, do you have recommendations of tools to help learn where those discretionary lines are and how to determine when to flex those lines?
Well, so I'm going to put this question back to Matt, because here's I saw that pop up, and I'm actually really curious about your answer, Matt, because I think these are so culturally specific. I think they're religious tradition specific. I think that they're potentially even, gender specific, because of the way that, developmentally, we don't all develop at the same rate. We advance sometimes faster and slower than others. And so, in general, what I like to say is like, be the adult in the room and be the only adult in the room. Don't ask kids to do the work that they shouldn't have to do. They shouldn't even have to know what questions they are supposed to be asking. Like that's what our job is as an adult. But also be the adult in the room and hold them accountable and do those things. But in terms of like how we apply that with discretion, I think that really does get down to what are the values of my community and of this place. And I'm curious, Matt, about how you would counsel there about. We're not going to come up with a list tonight, but if there are any rules of thumb or resources that you know of,
we're going to tell you the movies. That
right. Like Finding Nemo is fine, right?
This could be a whole thing in and of itself. I know that teaching youth culture, trends, and issues at Jessup, when we're talking with young adults that want to work with teens for their life, and we're talking about the different creative outlets and tech outlets for teens. And we have to just start going through and not just talking about what's there and how to understand culture and engage with the culture, but we have to start then going, okay, how do we help young people discern?
Yeah.
And it's this big process. I wish I had some other notes in front of me, because I'd love to pull those up and kind of use some of the key pieces that I talk about. But I know one part we always come back to is trying to just assert dialogue on stuff. Now there's ages where we have to go there's times where we have to always identify that every student and child is different. And so you have to be able, as a parent and as an adult, work that discernment first.
Yeah.
What can they handle? And I think that's the first question, because I know with some of Epstein's work, he talks about how like we have to be able to look at every teen or every young adult differently, because we do those blanket statements of we say, oh, they're still kids. And yet I know that there's some of you listening that some of your own kids that at 14, they were more mature than 25-year-olds right now.
A lot of students like that.
Yeah. And then you meet 25-year-olds that you're like, how did you make it this far? So some of it is you have to discern where that person's at to be able to gauge, I think, some of those discretionary lines. So some of them have been exposed to a lot more stuff earlier, and so then you have to work with either sometimes unpacking that. Some parenting models, which, like we're not against or for that. Some parenting models want to be more defensive. Some want to be more offensive. And so that's a whole nother element that I think that affects the discretionary. I mean, biblically, we always want to go back to things that are pure and things that are wholesome, but that still takes work for you as an adult discerning how you understand that within culture. And so then you're actually having bigger conversations on cultural elements within the Western culture and how we engage on stuff, right? Like, because that's when you have to decide, is it okay for me to watch The Office? And when is it okay for my team to watch The Office? When can they handle the conversation about sexual content or conversation about struggles of different natures or something like that? Like, and those are things where you have to go, okay, like there's things that we allow ourselves to do. And if we just make it a line of them being 18, well, once they're 18, they can make their own decision. Then you actually haven't trained them
Right.
in discretion. You're just letting a number that's actually based more on economic security and stability. I mean, there's some mental and cognitive things I understand within that. So anyways, I can talk too much on that. It's a very good question, though. I'm glad that somebody asked that because that's a constant work that we're doing as adults.
Yeah, agreed.
Another question came through on if our teen doesn't want to go to church, should we make them?
Yeah.
This one's really good for what we've been talking about with relational authority.
It's an excellent question, and it's one that I think it's worth asking what you value as a parent, right? Why does attendance matter to you that you might think about making them attend? And I don't think that it's and this is maybe not a research-driven position as much as it is just a value statement. Like we believe at Springtide, it's you can't have a young person's life can't truly be flourishing if their faith life is not also flourishing in some way, shape, or form. And there's a lot of ways that can look. One of the ways that can look is like attendance. So I think what I would say, thankfully, most young people are not completely shut down to that conversation. In fact, most want to have various elements of and I say conversation here metaphorically, like in the, what is either attendance or actual conversation or whatever. And I think I wouldn't let them off the hook about being able to disengage from conversations of faith across the board. And if you're like, well, I don't have any time, expertise, or anything else, the only way that we're going to do these conversations is at church, then I would say maybe make them go to church. If there are other outlets for this, but like church is just the thing that they hate most, then like maybe you put a pause on that for just a minute. But I wouldn't let them, I don't think there's much to be gained by letting them not examine their faith life in the same way that, I don't think that there's much to be gained by, somebody who's sort of, finds new groups to be uncomfortable, not engaging with new groups. Like their social lives need to flourish too. So yeah, like that makes us all uncomfortable, but part of growing up is that you learn the skills to engage with new groups of people that you've never met before. And so I think that would be for me, that would be the more important guiding star than just showing up for the sake of having your young person show up on a Sunday, but making sure that they understand where your values lie.
Mm-hmm. And I think within the ministry world, especially at Bridgeway, but a lot of places, you want to find the environment that's going to have the highest level of relational engagement.
Yeah.
So for instance, with Bridgeway, our weekend services are similar more to the program of the weekend in the main service for adults. You're going to have some worship, you're going to have a message, and then people are going to, go with the rest of their weekend day. Our midweek, our Wednesday nights, has some of those elements, a little bit more of some playful and social engagement before and after, because there's a lot more of that environment, but they also have small groups. And so that's where they're getting a time to be with 6, 8, 10 other people their age, but often with another adult or two, where they're processing some of those questions and working through that. And so I always encourage people to try to get your students to that. And I would also echo that same piece of getting them to things that are longer term, fight the battles for getting them to go to something like a camp or a retreat versus just trying to get them to go to the every weekend. Because sometimes it's once they go to those that they get a social connection, both sometimes with people their own peers, but then also with some of the adult leaders, and then allow that to be nurtured. And then this is where we also can get very creative, where you go, hey, like sometimes there's some of our students that they're really passionate about X. And then you go, man, I've met people at our church that are very passionate about X. And how do I just get them to have some exposure to that? So like, these guys really like motorcycles, and my son or daughter wants to really, get, how do I get them to go spend time in that way? There's a men's group here at our church that does a Tuesday night barbecue every 6 weeks. And they're in this area called Lincoln, and it's mostly men that gather to it. But what's been happening is you've been having high school guys coming around it, and now they're around with these other 20, adult guys learning, talking, eating together, and it just naturally happened. And some of them, they're there with their dads and stuff. But it's a beautiful example of you can get creative and get innovative with some of these things. I got a couple other questions, and we're still doing good on time. So one asks, how much does peer connection come into play versus adult leader connection? And I might need a little bit more clarification, Jim, just because that could go 7 different directions. How do you read that, Josh?
Well, I think you might be asking about in terms of combating loneliness, and I would say that they do different things. So you're probably not going to have a young person who feels really connected and super engaged and like they have a sense of belonging somewhere if they only have one or the other. And if they do, it's probably there's probably something else going on there that needs to be addressed. If they find that all of their really close relationships are with adults, like that's a little bit off for a teenager. And if they find that, they don't have any adults, and I would get real concerned with who's influencing them, and how that, the young people get together, and especially in groups, can make some really poor decisions. So you want somebody in their head being like, are we sure we should do this, y'all? So it's that you feel, there's no substitute for peer relationships. That is obviously the thing that young people crave most. They will never want you as much as they want their friends, because on a day-to-day basis, their friends are going to be the thing that sort of fills them up, also drags them down. What adults provide, or rather what adults should provide, is a steadiness, a TikTok. Like, I came and asked you about algebra on Monday. On Wednesday, we watched a sitcom together. 3 months later, I'm still asking you about algebra. And also, do you believe in heaven? Like, and that's how that is, it is the consistency of adult relationships that leads to these big questions that they probably, because their peer relationships fluctuate so much, what they told us about when they were telling us that they don't want adults to be their friends, this one young person said, I have friends. They cause as much drama in my life as anything else. I don't want adults to do that too. Right? And I thought that was just so, and I was like, oh yeah, I remember being a young person, like, my friends caused a lot of drama, and I probably caused a lot of drama in their lives at times. So they don't really always feel comfortable. Like, those conversations are probably not first coming up with their friends. It's not until they've had a chance. What they're doing when they talk to you about faith, they're not talking about faith in the same way that they're talking with their friends about it. In the sort of social psychological world, what we're doing is rehearsing, and this happens all the time in various aspects of life. We rehearse an argument or a question or even a particular identity with one group of people. We see how it goes. Maybe we don't pull it off very well. Maybe we get laughed at, and maybe we find out that we're okay with getting laughed at because we like the identity so much, or we're so interested in the conversation that it's worth being awkward, or maybe it goes super well, and so we're going to do it exactly that way all the time. But we find different groups of people where we can try on those different hats, and then we take everything that we've learned in that place, what social psychologists would call the backstage, and we sort of move it to front stage, and we start broadcasting it to the people in our reference groups, the people who we care about the most. But we rarely take that big kind of risk for the first time with that core group. So as the sort of TikTok steadiness of adults, you get to be, if you do it right, and you make that kind of connection, then you get to be that place where young people try stuff out. And that's largely what being a teenager is trying stuff out. And it's a great place to be. Yeah,
I like that. And one good thing, as you were sharing about all that, it reminded me, for everyone that's listening, and some of these reports they do, and this is one of the things, Josh, I think is really excellent about what you guys do with the documents and the work you guys are putting together. is on it. They have links on the PDFs, especially, that you can click on that take you to interviews with young adults, and as well as sometimes further conversations or explorations on some of the things that they were talking about within that relational authority report. And what I like about that is that's doing very direct, and Josh and I were talking about this on a phone call, very direct ethnography type of material where you're actually interacting, talking with people and trying to glean from what they're sharing, and they're being transparent and allowing themselves to be interviewed, and those types of things. Anytime you get a chance to do that, it just increases all of this dialogue and search for how do we do this and what do we do, because it's just like sometimes we say in premarital counseling with couples about how everything comes back to communication.
Mm-hmm.
It's the same thing with parenting, and it's the same thing with relationships, both psychologically, emotionally, and then we all know it spiritually as well.
Yeah. And we have this, I can't remember if we talked about this, Matt. We have this podcast called The Voices of Young People, and we do a new season every time we put out a study. So we just came out with a study called Work Life, about what Gen Z is looking for out of work and how we can support them, because increasingly work is the place where Gen Z is making meaning. Super weird place for employers to be, because they think that that's the kind of work, that's the kind of stuff that should happen in other places, not at work. But it's a really important place for us to be as adults, where, if you're going to live a meaningful life, if you're going to live a faithful life, how does that show up in a place where we spend most of our time at work? And anyway, so that's the current season that's out, is hearing young people talk all about how they think about work-life balance and what that means to them. One of my favorite seasons so far, and we just recorded the one that'll come out this fall, is for the voices of young people, because we take out the interviewer's voice completely, and we've got young people all ages from 13 to 25, all different backgrounds, all different faith traditions, and you're just getting a chance to hear them talk about what their faith lives look like, and getting to hear them say that in their own words, whether you have an actual job that works with young people, or if you're a parent. I just think it's so illuminating to hear how well considered, whether you agree with them or disagree with them, or sometimes the ideas are just like, what? But they're never like, oh, I don't know, I never think about it, and yesterday I came up with this answer for your question. Like, it's always, they have put thought into this, and that is, I think, the biggest takeaway.
Yeah, so good. And Pastor Brian put that podcast link.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah. So you guys, anyone can try to save that. And if you guys ever have questions, feel free to email us or go on to Springtide's website and check out more of their information there. There's a lot of good resources out there. Springtide does a lot. We have some partnerships with Axis, as well as, like, we're always kind of gleaning new stuff. And there was another question that I think goes back to some of the discretionary lines again. Somebody was asking about their 14-year-old granddaughter listens to a secular Korean band. She says they teach her self-love, and what do you think about that? And again, I think these questions, they keep bringing us back into the need that I think is important. And this is what I do try to teach people that are going into youth ministry, is how do you engage with the culture of a young person so that you can show that listening, that care. And I like St. Augustine, I think, said it. He said, we'll love that which is loved by the people we love most. It's a very good statement, because he's not saying to go and, like, throw yourself into the culture and believe what the culture says, but he's saying we have to kind of get behind. If we want young people to come convicted, we have to get behind and risk drawing close to them in relationships and talking to them about that music. And you might not like it.
Well, also, can we agree that I don't think any grandparents have ever liked the music that their grandkids are listening to?
No.
And that's teenagers.
That's a whole sociological thing, right, Josh?
Yeah.
Because what imprints on your mind when you're in your 12 to 18, right? And then whether or not you sing it or dance to it, all of that imprints more within the brain. I love talking about that aspect of the songs that stick and repetition of stuff. But yeah, just being willing to kind of get behind them. Walt Mueller, who was one of the kind of main youth guys around for a while, he says, he kind of talks about how culture is not just a map for young people, but it's a mirror for us, that we have to picture ourselves standing behind young people as they look into the mirror of their culture. And we're like looking over their shoulders at the reflection. And we want to get a chance to know how I can talk to them about that and build enough of that relational authority that you can have really good dialogue of why that, for instance, teaches her self-love and what other things might be teaching her self-love in her life outside of that Korean band. And just having that conversation as a grandparent, Christine, like that, you are already in such a rich spot that some grandparents will never get into to have that conversation.
The fact that you even know what your granddaughter is listening to.
Yeah, win number one.
Yep.
So
Indeed.
Yeah. So, well, Josh, this has been so good. Really appreciate, again, everything you guys are doing. Please relay that to your whole team. They have quite
Thank you, man.
a big group of people that are a part of research across the entire year, as well as setting up these documents graphically and with data. And, there's a lot that goes into it all. Thank you for your leadership in it, and for the ways God's gifted you with your mind and your passion to go kind of create something like Springtide and equip parents, equip people. So we thank you for that, and constantly be praying for all of us over here in California, for just all of us that are working with the young adults out here. And as we all know, it's a daily journey. It's a daily adventure. And I'll kind of leave you guys with this thought on that. The word adventure in Latin means adventura, means that which must happen. And so I always am encouraged by that, because adventure can be amazing and it can be frightening at the same time.
Yes.
And that's what some of this is. But I mean, there are tools, there are ways for us to re-find our footing for what you're doing on a day-to-day basis. And so I'm just going to finish by praying over those of you that are parents and those of you guys that are working. And Josh, thank you again for your time, and look forward to maybe getting you on here again to talk some more as more reports come out.
It's been a pleasure, and the questions were great. I really appreciate everybody being here on a Sunday evening.
Yeah, that's the best time.
Yes.
All right, let me pray. Lord Jesus, again, we praise you because you love these young people way more than we ever can. You understand them, Lord. You are there when they are amidst these places of loneliness and isolation. And so, Lord, we pray for your revelatory power and presence to show up in those moments apart from people. But we know that you're a God that created us to be relational, and that, Lord, you put men, women, family, church, even in our culture, Lord, coaches, educators, and so many other ways, Lord, that men and women of God especially can be bringing in this relational authority and showing students their value before you, and increasing their understanding of you and their understanding of themselves, and growing their identities. And so, Lord, we pray for your grace. We pray for your patience to fall upon us. Give us your wisdom so that we can function in discretion, and teach them how to do that. Lord, we pray for all these different ways, Lord, that we're going to have opportunities starting tomorrow morning, if not tonight, to see where transparency and integrity and listening and care and expertise, Lord, can come into play. And God, continue to show us how to do that well. Continue to give us encouragement. And Lord, for those that work with teens and young adults on a regular basis, God, I pray for extra resilience and encouragement for them, Lord, and continue to bring us all together in partnership. We thank you, Lord, for partnership across the nation, and getting a chance, Lord, to talk with Dr. Packard and the work that his team has done. And so, Lord, we honor you because you're the one that brings all these things together, and we love you. And we ask this all in the name of your son, Jesus. Amen. Amen. All right, everyone. Well, we thank you, and we look forward to, if you have further questions, always feel free to contact us. And I'll kind of give one last little reminder. As you heard tonight, relational presence of adults is so key. And so know that, like, our student ministries, especially, if not our children's ministries, is always in need of men and women to come in and be those adults that sometimes it's not that you have to be able to, like, be a part of a program. It's a chance to just go, and you might be that one adult that relates to a young student that they needed someone that cared about them. They needed just one of those connections, or you might be their second or their third in a week. And So know that the student ministries need you, and if you're ever interested in that, you can contact Pastor Cliff or Pastor Ryan, or always shoulder tap any of us pastors here at Bridgeway. So thanks, everyone, and have a great night.